It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon in Texas, the kind of day when everything seemed ordinary but nothing would ever be the same again. 17-year-old Emily Carter had just finished a long day of classes at the local high school. Her bright smile and outgoing nature had made her one of the most loved students in her class. She had plans to meet her friends at the local park after school, as she often did, but that day was different. Emily never arrived. Her mother, Grace, had expected her to walk through the door as she always did, with her usual chatter about school, friends, and life in general. But when 6:30 p.m. passed and Emily was still nowhere to be found, concern started to creep into Grace's heart. She called Emily's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in as the hours stretched on with no word from her daughter. The family's worry deepened when a neighbor reported that they had seen Emily walking towards the park, as she had planned. But no one had seen her after that. The park, just a few blocks away from their home, was usually a safe place. It was well lit and always filled with families, joggers, and kids on swings. The thought that something could happen to Emily there seemed almost impossible. But as the clock ticked on, the possibility of something terrible began to loom. Grace's first instinct was to drive to the park, but when she arrived, there was no sign of Emily. Her heart pounded in her chest as she frantically searched every corner of the park, asking anyone who would listen if they had seen her daughter. It was getting late, and the shadows of evening had begun to stretch across the landscape. Still, Emily was nowhere to be found. With a knot in her stomach, Grace rushed home and called the police. The authorities took the call seriously, launching an immediate search operation. The police scoured the park, spoke to witnesses, and even interviewed Emily's friends, but no one had any idea where she had gone. Grace couldn't understand it. Emily had never gone missing before. She was a good kid, responsible, and always kept in touch. She wasn't the kind to wander off or run away from home. The next day, the search intensified. Dozens of volunteers joined the police in combing through the area, looking for any clues that might lead to Emily's whereabouts. Flyers with her photo were distributed all over town, asking anyone who might have seen something to come forward. Emily's friends held vigils, and her family clung to the hope that she would be found safe, walking back through that door as if nothing had happened. But as the days passed, the hope began to fade, and the police were forced to acknowledge what everyone feared. Emily was not just missing, she had been taken. The small town of Roswell, Texas, was shaken to its core. The community, known for its tight-knit relationships and calm lifestyle, was now facing an unimaginable reality. Emily's disappearance was no longer just a local issue. It was a case that would bring attention from far beyond their small town. The questions were endless. Who would take a 17-year-old girl from a safe park in broad daylight? Why would anyone want to harm her? And most pressing of all, where was Emily? Emily's mother, Grace, held on to the belief that her daughter would be found alive. She spent sleepless nights scouring news reports, holding on to the faint hope that there might still be a mistake. But the weeks passed and there was no word from the police, no new leads, and no sign of Emily. It was the beginning of a journey that would span years, with families, detectives, and a community searching for answers. But it would take over a decade, new technologies, and a series of shocking twists before the truth about what had happened to Emily Carter was finally uncovered. The disappearance of Emily Carter sent ripples of fear through the small Texas town of Roswell. As the reality of her abduction settled in, the authorities quickly shifted into high gear. The local police department, alongside the FBI, launched a full-scale investigation. Emily's case was now one of their top priorities, but they faced an uphill battle. Despite their best efforts, every lead seemed to dead end, and every search brought nothing more than frustration. Detective Sam Richards, a seasoned investigator known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts, was assigned to the case. He had dealt with missing persons before, but something about Emily's case felt different. There was an unsettling edge to the mystery, a nagging feeling that this wasn't just a case of a runaway teen. Emily's family was well known in the community, and the thought that someone in their small, close-knit town could be responsible sent a chill down Richard's spine. In the initial days, the police followed every lead. They interviewed Emily's friends, classmates, and even teachers. They retraced her steps to the park, scouring every inch of the area for any clue, footprints, abandoned belongings, or anything that could point to where she had gone. But the park was empty and there were no signs of a struggle. The only clue that seemed to offer any hope was Emily's phone, which had been found at the edge of the park. However, it had been wiped clean of all data, a move that sent alarm bells ringing in Richard's mind. It didn't take long for him to suspect that someone had been involved in the crime, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Emily's family was in disbelief. Grace, her mother, was beside herself with worry and grief. She couldn't understand why her daughter had been taken or why anyone would want to hurt her. The police assured her that they were doing everything they could, but as days turned into weeks, Grace's frustration grew. The lack of answers left her feeling helpless, but she refused to give up. Every day she plastered new flyers around town, hoping someone would come forward with the crucial piece of information that would break the case wide open. Meanwhile, Detective Richards began to shift his focus. Initially, he had hoped to find a witness, someone who had seen something unusual on the day Emily went missing. But after combing through the neighborhood and speaking to countless people, he realized that there were no eyewitnesses. The area around the park was usually quiet, and there were no surveillance cameras to catch a glimpse of the person responsible. The investigation team began to dig deeper into Emily's life. They uncovered a few startling details. Emily had been getting strange messages on her phone in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The texts were vague and unnerving, with phrases like, "I'm watching you," and "you'll be sorry." These messages were traced back to an anonymous number, but the trail went cold. As the investigation stalled, the police considered all possible theories. Was this a case of a random kidnapping? Or had someone close to Emily been involved? Detective Richards was determined to find the truth, but with each passing day the case grew colder. The absence of clear evidence weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's disappearance was no accident, that someone out there knew exactly what had happened. The small town, once full of hopeful smiles, became a place of suspicion. Neighbors began to look at each other differently, wondering who could be hiding something. Some even whispered that the abduction was the work of a stranger passing through, someone who would never be caught. But others wondered if Emily had known her captor, someone she trusted or even loved. This theory seemed the most haunting. If the person who had taken Emily was someone close to her, someone who could blend in with the community, it meant the killer might still be walking among them. As the weeks turned into months and the months into years, the investigation seemed to lose its momentum. Every new piece of evidence led to more questions, and the police were left grasping at straws. The community's hope faded with each passing day, and the story of Emily's disappearance slowly drifted into the background of local news. But for Detective Richards, Emily's case would never be forgotten. He continued to search for answers, hoping that one day someone would come forward with the truth. The days following Emily's disappearance were filled with a growing sense of urgency. The town of Roswell, once a quiet and peaceful place, was now consumed by a relentless search for answers. The police, bolstered by a surge of volunteers, worked around the clock, scouring every possible location for any sign of Emily. The sense of community was palpable as neighbors, friends, and strangers alike joined in the search effort. They canvassed the local park where Emily had last been seen, covered miles of wooded terrain, and even searched nearby waterways, hoping for a breakthrough. The volunteers came in droves. People from surrounding towns drove into Roswell, lending a hand. Some handed out flyers, others searched the woods, while a few stayed behind to man the phones in case anyone called with information. The sense of camaraderie was strong, yet the feeling of helplessness grew as the days turned into weeks. Each morning, the search would resume with renewed energy, but as the sun set, each day seemed to bring more questions and fewer answers. Grace, Emily's mother, was torn between staying home, clinging to the hope that Emily might walk through the door any minute, and joining the search. She felt as though every fiber of her being was urging her to go out and search for her daughter. But what could she do? What could any of them do? Still, she couldn't just sit idly by, so she joined the volunteers, walking along the trails with her heart heavy, her mind swirling with fear and anxiety. She would pause, calling out Emily's name, hoping for an echo, praying for a sign. But no response ever came. The police organized multiple search parties, but with each unsuccessful day, the hope that someone would find a clue, a scrap of clothing, or a hidden piece of evidence began to fade. The only breakthrough came when a K-9 unit was brought in to search the area. The dogs worked tirelessly, sniffing the ground, barking at trees, and attempting to find any trace of Emily's scent. Yet, the hours passed with nothing more than empty spaces and the occasional bark of frustration. Emily's scent had vanished. A few volunteers found items that seemed to offer hope, but none led to concrete evidence. A pair of Emily's earrings were found on the edge of a road near the park, but there was no way to prove they belonged to her. A sweater was found in a nearby alley, but it didn't match the clothing Emily had been wearing that day. The small town's optimism began to wane, as no one could figure out where Emily had gone or who could have taken her. The police, now under intense pressure from the family and the growing public demand for answers, expanded their efforts. They contacted neighboring counties, enlisted the help of search and rescue teams, and even reached out to federal agencies for further assistance. The FBI was called in to provide support, bringing in a new set of investigators with specialized skills in missing persons cases. They conducted a more methodical investigation, going door to door in the neighborhood surrounding the park, interviewing more people, and looking for anything that could lead to the discovery of Emily's whereabouts. With the passing of time, the search for Emily evolved. It became less about searching for a missing person and more about uncovering the truth behind her disappearance. The police began to examine the possibility that someone in the town knew more than they were letting on. Interviews with Emily's friends revealed nothing unusual, yet something felt off. Detective Richards started to suspect that whoever had taken Emily might be hiding in plain sight, someone who had evaded suspicion for so long that they had become invisible. Despite the exhaustion and mounting frustration, Grace refused to stop. She kept faith that anyone would come forward with the answers. She attended every press conference, spoke at community meetings, and coordinated with volunteers who continued to search for Emily. The people of Roswell, once a sleepy, quiet community, had rallied together, but they too were growing weary. The unanswered questions loomed large. Every search turned up nothing, every lead ended in frustration, and the specter of fear hung over the town. The family's pain was unbearable, and each passing day without answers only deepened their grief. Grace spent sleepless nights hoping and praying that her daughter would be found safe. But as the months stretched on, Emily's case seemed to be fading from the forefront of the public's mind. It was no longer the leading story on the local news, and the volunteers began to dwindle. Emily's face no longer graced the front pages of newspapers, and her disappearance became another unsolved case. But Detective Richards, along with his team, never let go. As the weeks became months and then years, they kept the case alive, continuing to search for answers. They knew that finding Emily was more than just solving a crime, it was about giving a family closure, about finding the truth no matter how long it took. Months had passed since Emily Carter's disappearance, and as time wore on, the sense of urgency in the town of Roswell began to fade. Yet, for Detective Sam Richards, the case had become an obsession. The more he investigated, the deeper the mystery grew. The early days had been filled with hope, a belief that they would find Emily quickly, but as weeks turned into months, that hope slowly turned into frustration. Each new lead seemed to fade into nothingness, each clue raised more questions than answers. The case had now become one of those rare unsolved disappearances that haunted everyone involved. The police had thoroughly searched every inch of the park, nearby woods and surrounding areas, but there was still no sign of Emily. There was no blood, no evidence of a struggle, and no trace of where she might have gone. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no footprints, no answers, and no closure for her family. Detective Richards had been in law enforcement long enough to know that the absence of physical evidence didn't necessarily mean that there was no evidence at all. He began to focus on the things that others had overlooked. He reviewed every statement, every detail from the interviews that had been conducted months ago. It became clear that Emily had been seen walking toward the park, but no one had witnessed anything unusual beyond that. The mysterious absence of any witnesses was troubling. How could someone simply disappear in broad daylight without anyone noticing? Richard started to suspect that Emily's abduction was no random act. Something felt intentional about it. He revisited the most recent interviews with Emily's friends and family. Emily had always been social, never one to hide secrets, but a closer look revealed some subtle clues. One of her friends, a girl named Sarah, had mentioned in passing that Emily had been acting distant in the weeks before her disappearance. While this wasn't unusual for a teenager, it was the first hint of something personal, something that might explain why Emily had vanished. Detective Richards dug deeper into Emily's social life, trying to find any connection that could lead to an answer. He found that Emily had recently ended a brief relationship with a boy named Luke, a quiet, introverted kid from her high school. It seemed innocent enough, a typical breakup between teenagers, but something about the timing of it felt off. Richards learned that Emily had been unusually upset after their breakup. She had confided in Sarah that she felt Luke wasn't being completely honest with her, but she didn't elaborate further. As Richards continued to follow this thread, he uncovered something even more unsettling. Luke had been seen leaving his house the evening that Emily went missing. Witnesses who were interviewed later confirmed that he had been acting strangely, almost as though he was hiding something. Richards couldn't ignore the possibility that Luke had something to do with Emily's disappearance, but there was no direct evidence tying him to the crime. His alibi was shaky at best, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest. Another lead that had initially been dismissed came back into focus: the anonymous messages Emily had received in the weeks before her disappearance. While the police had originally assumed the texts were harmless, Richards now realized that they might have been a crucial clue. The messages, which had been traced back to a burner phone, suggested that someone had been watching Emily closely, even before she disappeared. The texts, though vague, hinted at someone who was either obsessed with her or had a personal vendetta against her. Richards couldn't shake the feeling that the case had taken on a more sinister tone. Whoever had taken Emily wasn't a random stranger. They knew her, or at least knew something about her. The idea that Emily's abduction might have been carried out by someone she trusted, or someone who was close to her, became more and more plausible. As weeks stretched into months, the investigation seemed to stall. The case had grown cold, and with no new evidence coming to light, the community's focus started to shift. But not for Richards. He continued to review the details, looking for anything that had been missed, any small detail that could hold the key to unlocking the mystery. Then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A man named Jack Taylor, who lived near the park, came forward with information he had kept to himself for months. He had seen a car parked in the same spot on the night Emily disappeared, a car he hadn't recognized. At first he hadn't thought much of it, but something about that moment had stuck with him. When he finally came forward, Richards decided to investigate the lead. It wasn't much, but it was something. Richards sent a team to search for the car, hoping it might lead to a new piece of evidence. The more Richards uncovered, the more complex the case became. The town of Roswell had been shaken to its core, and with no answers in sight, suspicion began to settle over everyone. The question wasn't just who had taken Emily, it was why. The deeper they dug into her life, the more disturbing the revelations became, leaving the police with one undeniable truth: Emily had been the victim of a well-orchestrated plan. But by whom? And more importantly, why? As the years passed since Emily Carter's disappearance, the case gradually became one of those haunting, unsolved mysteries that would occasionally resurface in the media, only to fade back into the shadows. But for Detective Sam Richards, the case had never left his mind. He had taken Emily's disappearance personally. The unanswered questions, the eerie silence from the community, and the endless roadblocks during the investigation weighed heavily on him. It had been nearly 5 years since Emily vanished, and with each passing day, he felt the burden of her unsolved case on his shoulders. By now, Emily's story had become a faint memory for most, but Richards was determined not to let it slip into oblivion. He kept reviewing old files, cross-checking the evidence, hoping for a new angle, something that had been overlooked, something that could finally lead to a breakthrough. He wasn't willing to let Emily's case become another cold file buried in the archives. Then one day a call came in that would change everything. A breakthrough, small but significant, came from an unexpected place: technology. New forensic advancements in DNA analysis had developed over the years, and Detective Richards had always kept up with the latest methods. The FBI had recently created a new division specializing in the reinvestigation of cold cases using advanced DNA testing and genealogical databases. Richards had been skeptical at first. Many years had passed since the initial investigation, and he feared that the physical evidence would be long gone. But when the DNA evidence from the scene was re-examined, it produced a result that no one expected. A trace of blood, hidden for so long in the fabric of Emily's torn jacket, had been found. Though it was minimal, the new technology allowed investigators to trace it back to a distant relative. The breakthrough wasn't immediate, but with careful research, they managed to narrow down a list of potential suspects connected to that bloodline. Richards felt a surge of hope, realizing that after all this time, they were one step closer to solving the mystery. The search for Emily's kidnapper began anew, but this time it was different. The genealogical database had identified a match to a distant relative, someone who had lived in the area around the time of Emily's disappearance. This new lead didn't point to a random stranger but rather to someone who had ties to the local community, someone who had been under the radar for years. The man's name was Aaron Daniels, a middle-aged man with no criminal record, but whose family history was marked by secrecy. Daniels had never been on the police's radar, and his name had never come up during the initial investigation. But the new forensic evidence showed a connection between Daniels and the blood found on Emily's jacket. The connection was distant, but it was enough to bring him into focus. Richards couldn't believe it at first. Daniels had no prior history that linked him to any sort of criminal activity. He had kept a low profile, living in the same town where Emily's family had resided. For years, Daniels had been considered a model citizen, a quiet man who kept to himself, never attracting any suspicion. But as Richards dug deeper into Daniel's background, he found troubling details that suggested a dark side, one that no one in Roswell had ever suspected. It turned out that Daniels had been involved in several strange, unexplained incidents over the years, but he had always managed to slip through the cracks. No one had connected the dots until now. In fact, his name had come up during an investigation into another cold case, but at the time the investigators had ruled him out as a suspect. It seemed like an odd coincidence that so many of his family members had been involved in other criminal activities, nothing serious enough to warrant attention, but enough to raise an eyebrow. Richards now had his sights set on Aaron Daniels. He requested a background check on him and his family, and what he uncovered painted a chilling picture. Daniels had been living in Roswell for most of his life, and his family had roots in the town that went back generations. But Richards also found something even more disturbing. Daniels had been living alone in a secluded house on the outskirts of town, not far from where Emily had disappeared. He had lived in the area for years, yet no one had ever thought to connect him to the case. The investigation took a more ominous turn when a retired police officer, who had worked on the case in its early days, came forward with new information. He had always suspected that someone close to Emily's family was involved. His gut instinct had told him that the crime was personal, but with no evidence to support his hunch, the theory had been dismissed. Now, with the new DNA evidence pointing to Daniels, it seemed like that hunch was correct. With this new lead, Detective Richards felt a renewed sense of determination. It wasn't just about solving Emily's case anymore, it was about finding the truth for the family and bringing justice to a community that had been shattered by the crime. The investigation had been revitalized, and there was finally a glimmer of hope that after all these years, Emily's disappearance would no longer be a mystery. The breakthrough in Emily Carter's case had sent ripples of shock throughout Roswell. Aaron Daniels, a man who had quietly lived among them for years, was now the prime suspect in a crime that had haunted the community for nearly 6 years. The police had finally connected him to the evidence through cutting-edge DNA technology, and Detective Sam Richards was on the verge of solving a case that had once seemed unsolvable. The arrest was a tense, nerve-wracking moment for everyone involved. Richards had spent days preparing for it, gathering all the necessary evidence to ensure they could make the arrest stick. Daniels had been living under the radar for years, and no one had suspected him to be involved in Emily's disappearance. But now, with DNA evidence tying him to the crime scene and a troubling history of secretive behavior, the time had come to bring him in. The arrest was carried out at Daniels' home, a modest, weathered house on the outskirts of town. The police, along with Richards, arrived early in the morning, hoping to catch Daniels off guard. There was no turning back now. Emily's case had gone from a distant memory to an active, urgent investigation, and the people of Roswell had been waiting for answers. They needed justice and they needed it now. As officers approached the house, the tension in the air was palpable. The door was knocked on, and moments later, Daniels appeared, his face calm, but his eyes betraying a flicker of surprise. He was informed that he was under arrest in connection with the disappearance of Emily Carter. Daniels stood frozen for a moment, his expression unreadable. But as the handcuffs clicked into place, a slight tremor ran through his body. He was being led out of his house, under arrest, but to the public, it was still hard to believe. How could it be him? People whispered. He was a quiet man, a man who had lived in the same town for years without raising suspicion. Everyone had thought of him as harmless, too harmless, in fact. But now, all those assumptions had been shattered in a matter of minutes. As the police car drove away from Daniels' house, the streets of Roswell began to stir with whispers. People gathered in small clusters, exchanging rumors and theories. "He was always so quiet," one person said. "I never thought he had it in him." The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, it became the only topic of conversation in the town. Aaron Daniels, a man who had spent years living among them, was the one who had taken Emily. And the arrest had happened so quickly, so suddenly, that it left the town in disbelief. But for Emily's mother, Grace, the news was bittersweet. It had been years since her daughter's disappearance, and the emotions that surged through her were overwhelming. There was a strange sense of relief that Emily's case was finally being solved, but the reality of it also brought a painful truth. Her daughter, the sweet, vibrant girl who had been taken so suddenly, was never coming back. The arrest of Daniels didn't bring her back. It didn't give her the chance to see Emily grow up, to graduate, to live her life. Still, it was a step toward closure, a step toward justice. Richards, too, was deeply affected by the arrest. He had spent years pursuing leads, chasing down every dead end, and struggling with the weight of Emily's case. This was his moment, his breakthrough. But as he sat in the car on his way to Daniel's interrogation, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. He knew that this was only the beginning. The hard part was just starting. They needed to secure a confession, find a motive, and connect Daniels to Emily's death in a way that would stand up in court. The interrogation room was cold, sterile, and tense. Richard sat across from Daniels, who was now visibly shaken. His composure had cracked the moment he realized that his quiet life was coming to an end. 4 hours, Daniels said little, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. Finally, Richards broke the silence. "You've been caught, Aaron," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We know what happened to Emily. We know about the blood at the scene, and we know about the messages you sent her." Daniels remained silent, his lips pressed tight together. But the pressure was mounting. Richards leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. "We have everything we need, Aaron. It's over. It's time to tell us the truth." The minutes stretched on, and just as Richards was about to push further, Daniels cracked. He lowered his head and let out a slow, defeated sigh. The confession, though reluctant, came pouring out. Daniels had been obsessed with Emily for years. He had watched her from a distance, and when she had broken up with Luke, he saw his chance. He had followed her to the park that fateful day, intending to confront her, but things had escalated. In a fit of rage, he had abducted her, taking her to his home. And from there, the details of what had happened became too difficult to process, too horrifying to repeat. Daniel's confession was chilling in its simplicity. He had taken Emily because he had convinced himself that she would eventually see him as more than just the quiet neighbor. But his obsession led him to murder, and the truth was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. As Daniels was led out of the interrogation room, the weight of his words settled on Richard's shoulders. The case that had haunted him for so long was finally coming to an end, but the cost was immeasurable. Emily's family would never get their daughter back. No arrest, no confession could undo the years of heartache. But at least they had answers. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. The arrest of Aaron Daniels sent shockwaves through the community, but the real challenge was just beginning. After years of uncertainty and unanswered questions, the case was finally heading to court. The town of Roswell, once full of whispers and suspicions, now had a firm anchor to hold on to. Justice was finally within reach. But the trial, which had the potential to bring resolution and closure, would not be without its own complexities. Grace, Emily's mother, had spent years waiting for this moment. The feeling of anticipation that hung in the air as the trial approached was suffocating. While she could hardly bear the thought of reliving the nightmare, she knew that Emily's story needed to be told. The courtroom was where the truth would finally come to light, and where Emily's voice in some form could be heard again. Grace spent sleepless nights preparing herself for what was to come, knowing that facing Daniels in court would be an emotional ordeal, one that would test her in ways she hadn't yet imagined. The trial was set in the state capitol, and the small courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and residents from Roswell. Emily's friends were there too, their faces a mix of grief and curiosity. Many of them had been closely tied to Emily, and they too felt the weight of the years-long investigation. The trial wasn't just about finding justice for Emily, it was about finding a way for the community to heal. As the proceedings began, the prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. The evidence against Aaron Daniels was overwhelming. The DNA evidence had been crucial, but it was the emotional testimony from the family and friends of Emily that really began to paint a picture of the young woman they had lost. Richards, the detective who had worked tirelessly on the case, took the stand, outlining the painstaking hours spent investigating Daniels and retracing the steps of that fateful day when Emily disappeared. He described the months of dead ends, the deadening frustration, and the eventual breakthrough that led them to Daniels. The defense, however, came out swinging. Daniels' attorney tried to cast doubt on the credibility of the DNA evidence, suggesting that it could have been planted or misinterpreted. They argued that there were too many inconsistencies in the case and that the prosecution was rushing to conclusions. But as the days passed and the testimonies mounted, the defense's arguments began to fall apart. The forensic evidence spoke for itself. Every detail, every witness account, every shred of the investigation pointed directly at Daniels as the man who had taken Emily. The first few days of the trial were emotionally charged. Grace sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on Daniels, who sat motionless at the defense table. His face was a mask of indifference, but Grace could see the cracks in his demeanor. It was as if the weight of his own guilt was beginning to show, even if he was refusing to admit it. The trial had been dragging him into a corner, one from which there was no escape. Grace, at one point, found herself having to leave the courtroom, unable to bear the weight of the evidence piling up against Daniels. She didn't want to hear about the hours her daughter had spent trapped in Daniels' home, but she knew she had to. This was the reality. This was the only way to give Emily the voice she had been denied for so long. The emotional toll of the trial was evident in the family. Emily's father, John, had remained quiet throughout the trial, his grief almost palpable. His face was etched with pain, and his eyes often welled with tears as the prosecution painted a portrait of his daughter's life, a life stolen far too soon. It was clear that the trial wasn't just a legal battle for the Carters. It was a fight for closure, for peace, and for the memory of a daughter they had never had the chance to say goodbye to. As the trial progressed, the community's support for the Carters was unwavering. People came forward to testify about the impact Emily had on their lives, her kindness, and her potential. The outpouring of love and support for the family gave Grace the strength to return to the courtroom each day, no matter how painful it was to relive the details of Emily's last days. As the prosecution wrapped up their case, Richards could feel the weight of the moment. This was the final piece. This was the climax of years of investigation, heartache, and determination. He had dedicated his life to solving Emily's case, and now, as the trial neared its end, he could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. The closing arguments would come next, and then the jury would deliberate. But Richards couldn't shake the feeling that the case wasn't over yet. There was still one final twist to come, one last moment of tension before they could all go home and finally move forward. He had been on this journey for so long that he knew, deep down, that this was the moment that would either bring peace to Emily's family or throw everything into turmoil once again. The final days of the trial were filled with an intensity that had never been seen before in Roswell. As the defense and prosecution delivered their closing arguments, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The jury had listened to days of testimony, sifted through pieces of damning evidence, and watched the emotional outpourings from those who knew Emily best. Now it was time for the truth to be fully revealed. But even as the closing arguments unfolded, no one could have predicted just how shocking the truth would be. The prosecution had laid out their case convincingly. Aaron Daniels had kidnapped Emily, and all the evidence pointed to him. DNA evidence, witness statements, and his own confession were all pieces that sealed the case against him. It seemed like the case was already closed. But just as the closing arguments wrapped up, a surprise witness took the stand, a last-minute addition that caught everyone off guard. It was Luke, Emily's ex-boyfriend. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he stepped into the courtroom. The jury, the prosecution, and even Daniels himself stared in disbelief. Luke had not been part of the investigation up until this moment. His sudden appearance was nothing short of shocking, and his words would soon send ripples of confusion throughout the entire courtroom. Luke stood before the jury, his voice shaky but resolute. He began by explaining his relationship with Emily. They had been in love, he said, until they had a falling out. The breakup, while painful, had been amicable and they had remained friends. But over time he began to notice strange behavior. Emily had seemed distant, distracted, and increasingly paranoid. She had mentioned receiving odd, threatening messages, but had never spoken about who was sending them. Luke assumed it was just part of her stress from school or life, and he had tried to comfort her as best as he could. But one night, Emily had told him something that would change everything. Luke recalled that Emily had confided in him the night before she disappeared. She had told him that she was being watched and that someone was following her. Emily had been terrified. She had even gone so far as to tell Luke that she thought someone in the town knew about her breakup with him and was using it to manipulate her. At the time, Luke hadn't known what to think. But now, in hindsight, everything seemed clearer. She had been scared. And worse, Luke began to suspect that Emily had been referring to Aaron Daniels. Luke's revelation stunned everyone in the courtroom. It was clear now that Emily had been aware of Daniels' obsession with her. What had initially been seen as a harmless fixation on a quiet neighbor now seemed much darker. Daniels had been watching Emily for months, even before the breakup with Luke. But it wasn't just his obsession that made Luke's testimony so powerful, it was what he revealed next. In an unexpected twist, Luke confessed that he had kept something from the police all these years. He had been the one who had found the mysterious burner phone with the threatening messages. The phone, which had been traced back to Daniels, had been in Luke's possession for months, hidden away in a drawer. He had found it in the park right after Emily's disappearance. But in his grief, in his own confusion, Luke had kept the phone hidden, unsure of what to do with it. His silence, he now admitted, had been a mistake, a grave one. Luke's confession brought a collective gasp from the courtroom. The revelation that the phone had been in his hands all along was more than just a twist. It was the final missing piece that connected Aaron Daniels directly to Emily's abduction. The prosecution had believed they had everything they needed to convict Daniels, but Luke's confession added an entirely new layer of complexity to the case. Aaron Daniels, who had remained silent throughout the trial, was now visibly shaken. The calm facade he had maintained since the arrest was crumbling. The truth was slipping through his fingers, and it was becoming clear that his attempt to control the narrative had failed. The defense quickly tried to discredit Luke's testimony, but the damage was already done. Daniels' obsession with Emily was no longer just a vague suspicion, it was a confirmed fact. And the revelation that Luke had hidden the burner phone, though it seemed like a minor detail at first, had provided the final link in the chain of evidence. The defense had no solid rebuttal to offer. The truth, once buried under layers of lies and secrets, had finally surfaced. As the jury deliberated, the community of Roswell was left to process the unimaginable. Aaron Daniels had been living in plain sight, hiding his dark obsession behind a mask of normalcy. The town that had once trusted him now felt betrayed. The family too was left reeling. Grace, Emily's mother, could hardly comprehend the enormity of what had been revealed. Emily had known. She had known all along that something wasn't right, and her fear had been real. But despite her fear, despite the warning signs, she had been taken from them anyway. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the trial drew to a close. Emily's story, once a painful mystery, had finally been pieced together. The truth had been revealed, but it came at a cost: Emily's life, her future, and the shattered peace of a small town. After weeks of deliberations, the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived: the sentencing of Aaron Daniels. The courtroom, once filled with whispers of doubt and speculation, was now heavy with an air of grim anticipation. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time for the justice system to deliver its verdict. Emily's family, her friends, and the entire town of Roswell were anxiously awaiting the outcome of the trial. Everyone hoped that the sentence would bring some sense of closure, even though it would never be enough to undo the pain they had suffered. Grace, Emily's mother, sat at the front of the courtroom, her heart racing. It had been a long and emotional journey, years of waiting, hoping, and praying for justice. Now, with the truth exposed and the man responsible for her daughter's death standing before her, Grace felt a rush of emotions flood over her. There was no joy in this moment. There was no relief. There was only a deep sense of loss. The pain of losing Emily would never go away, but perhaps with the right sentence they could begin to heal. Aaron Daniels, the man who had once been a familiar face in the community, sat motionless in the defendant's chair. His face, which had once been a mask of calm indifference, now showed signs of fear. The weight of his actions, of the crime he had committed, was finally sinking in. He had spent months sitting in a jail cell trying to process the consequences of his actions, but now, in the courtroom, the finality of it all was inescapable. He had been found guilty of kidnapping, murder, and the brutal violation of a young life, and now it was time for him to pay the price. The judge, an older man who had presided over countless cases in his long career, entered the room. The sound of his gavel striking the desk silenced the murmurs that filled the air. The moment had arrived. He read out the charges one last time, and then, with a steady voice, he turned to Aaron Daniels. Aaron Daniels, for the abduction and murder of Emily Carter, this court hereby sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the judge said, his voice unwavering. You have taken the life of a young woman, a daughter, a friend, and a student with boundless potential. Your actions have caused unimaginable pain to her family and to this community. There is no chance for redemption in this case. The law and this court have spoken. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she processed the sentence. Life in prison. Daniels would never again have the chance to walk free, to harm anyone else. But no matter how long he lived behind bars, it would never bring Emily back. It would never give her the future she had deserved. The sentence was justice, but it was a hollow victory. The pain of her loss remained. As the bailiffs moved in to escort Daniels out of the courtroom, he gave no reaction. He stood slowly, his eyes focused straight ahead, as if he had already accepted the inevitable. There was no remorse in his expression, no regret for the life he had stolen. His punishment had been handed down, and now he would be left to live out the rest of his days in a prison cell, alone with the memory of his crime. The family members of Emily sat in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of grim acceptance. Emily's father, John, who had been so quiet throughout the trial, now allowed his emotions to show. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs as he held his wife, Grace, close. He had never been able to fully express the pain of losing their daughter, but now, in this moment, the weight of it all became too much to bear. His tears, though silent, spoke volumes about the depths of his grief. Grace wiped away her own tears, her face a mask of both sorrow and strength. The sentence had been delivered, but it would not erase the years of heartache. It would not undo the pain of the long wait, of the uncertainty, and of the moments when they had feared that Emily would never be found. She had been taken from them in the blink of an eye, and nothing, not even the life sentence of her captor, could ever bring her back. As the courtroom cleared, the weight of the trial and the sentence settled on the town of Roswell. The streets that had once been filled with whispers now felt quieter, almost emptier. The residents of Roswell had watched the trial unfold, and while the verdict had brought some sense of justice, it had not brought back their innocence. The town would never be the same. Emily Carter's death had left a mark on every person who had known her, and that scar would remain, no matter how much time passed. But for Grace and John, there was one final piece of closure. They had fought for their daughter. They had fought for the truth, for the justice she deserved. And now, with the sentence handed down, they could finally begin the painful journey toward healing. The town of Roswell had never truly been the same since Emily Carter's disappearance. Once a peaceful, tight-knit community, it had now been scarred by the brutal loss of a young life and the subsequent trial that had dragged old wounds into the light. With Aaron Daniels convicted and sentenced, many hoped that the town could begin to heal, but the damage was far deeper than any sentence could undo. Grace and John, Emily's parents, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. While the conviction had brought them some semblance of justice, it didn't erase the gaping hole that Emily had left behind. They tried to return to their daily routines, to find some semblance of normalcy, but the absence of their daughter was like a shadow that followed them everywhere. The memories of Emily, once a bright and promising young woman full of life and potential, haunted them at every turn. Every room in their house reminded them of the daughter they had lost, every corner filled with reminders of the love they had once shared. For Grace, the pain was most acute when she walked into Emily's bedroom. The door, once filled with the sounds of Emily's laughter and chatter, now stood silent. The bed was neatly made, her belongings untouched. Grace often found herself sitting on the edge of Emily's bed, staring at the untouched room, her hands resting on the comforter as she remembered the girl she had raised. She had always been so full of life, so excited for the future. Emily's dreams, once so full of promise, would never come to fruition, and that was a grief Grace struggled to reconcile with every single day. John, too, wrestled with his grief in silence. He had never been one to openly display his emotions, but the loss of Emily had shattered him in ways he couldn't express. He worked tirelessly to provide for his family, but there was a deep emptiness in his heart that could never be filled. He often found himself thinking about what could have been, what Emily's life might have been like if she had been given the chance to grow, to experience the joys of adulthood. But the thought of that future, forever lost, was too painful to linger on. As time passed, the Carters found themselves drawn together in their shared grief. They spent long evenings talking about Emily, sharing stories of her childhood, and remembering the times when she had brought joy into their lives. But the quiet moments, filled with memories, were also the hardest. The realization that they would never hear her voice again, never see her laugh, was a weight that neither of them could escape. For the town of Roswell, life moved on, but the scars left by Emily's disappearance would remain forever. The community, once filled with comfort and safety, had now been changed by the dark secrets that had emerged during the trial. Neighbors, who had once trusted each other implicitly, now looked at each other with suspicion. The town had been shaken to its core, and though people tried to go back to their lives, there was an underlying tension that no one could shake. The police department, too, was forever affected by the case. Detective Sam Richards had worked tirelessly on Emily's case, dedicating years of his life to finding answers. While he had secured the conviction, the emotional toll it took on him was undeniable. He had seen too much death, too many tragedies in his career, but Emily's case had been different. He had become personally invested in bringing her killer to justice, and now that it was over, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything he had sacrificed. It wasn't just the case that had taken a toll on him, it was the lives of the people left behind, the families who had been forever changed by a single act of violence. The victims, too, were not just Emily's family but the entire town. The residents of Roswell were left to carry the burden of the crime, their lives forever altered by the darkness that had infiltrated their peaceful existence. They would never look at the quiet streets of their town the same way again. The once comforting familiarity of the park where Emily had vanished now held a new, chilling significance. It was no longer just a place for children to play or for families to gather, it was a reminder of a tragedy that would never be erased. For Emily's friends, the aftermath was just as difficult to process. They had been the ones closest to her in her final days. They had shared her laughter, her fears, and her secrets. They had grown up together, but now they had to learn to live with the heavy weight of grief. For Sarah, Emily's best friend, the pain was unbearable. She often found herself thinking of all the moments they would never share, the college graduations, the weddings, the milestones in life that they had once dreamed about. It was as if part of her had died with Emily, and she struggled to find a way to move forward without the girl who had once been her closest confidant. In the months and years that followed, Grace and John slowly began to rebuild their lives, though they would never be the same. They became advocates for victims of violent crime, using their voices to speak out on behalf of those who could no longer speak for themselves. But as much as they tried to channel their grief into something positive, there were moments when the pain was overwhelming. There were days when they would fall silent, lost in their thoughts, remembering the girl they had once known, and mourning the life she should have had. Roswell too began to recover, but it was a long, slow process. The town would never forget the tragedy that had struck it, but the healing had begun. The story of Emily Carter, once a symbol of hope and innocence, had become a tragic tale of loss and justice. But even in the midst of the pain, there was one thing that the town and Emily's family could hold on to: justice had been served and the truth had come to light. Emily Carter's memory would never be forgotten. Years had passed since the trial of Aaron Daniels, and the town of Roswell had slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The pain of Emily Carter's loss had never completely faded, but as time wore on, the community found ways to heal. People resumed their daily lives, albeit with a deeper understanding of the fragility of life and the hidden darkness that could sometimes lurk behind the most familiar faces. The scars would remain, but so too would the lessons learned from Emily's tragic death. For Grace and John, the years had been both a curse and a blessing. The raw pain of losing Emily had softened somewhat, though the grief remained a constant presence. They had done their best to rebuild, finding solace in each other and in the memory of their daughter. They had never stopped fighting for justice, and the conviction of Aaron Daniels had given them something they had longed for: a sense of finality. Emily's case, once a mystery that seemed unsolvable, had been brought to its conclusion. The man responsible for taking their daughter was behind bars, and the truth had been uncovered. But even with that knowledge, they found that there was no true closure. Grace often found herself standing in Emily's room, surrounded by the girl's belongings, as if hoping to feel her presence again. She would touch the books on the shelf, run her fingers over the clothes that still hung in the closet, and look at the pictures on the walls. In some ways, Emily's spirit seemed to linger in that space. But the room was also a painful reminder of what had been stolen from them. There were moments when Grace could almost hear Emily's voice, laughing, calling out to her, but it was always just a fleeting memory, a shadow that disappeared as quickly as it came. John, too, had moments of reflection. He had never been one for public displays of emotion, but the loss of his daughter had carved a deep wound in his heart. There were nights when he would sit alone, staring at the stars, thinking of all the milestones Emily would never reach. He imagined the young woman she would have become, the graduate, the wife, the mother. And in his mind, he would replay the moments when he had watched her grow up: her first steps, her first day of school, the time she had earned her driver's license. Those memories were precious, but they were also painful. They were the memories of a father who had lost everything. But amidst the sorrow, Grace and John had found ways to honor Emily's memory. They had set up a foundation in her name, dedicated to helping families of missing persons, offering support to those who were still searching for their loved ones. It wasn't much, but it was a way to ensure that Emily's life, though tragically short, would leave a lasting impact. They used their grief as fuel to help others, to advocate for justice, and to raise awareness about the dangers of violence and the importance of solving cold cases. Emily's story would not be forgotten. In the years that followed, Emily's friends kept her memory alive in their own ways. Sarah, Emily's best friend, had gone on to become a counselor, helping young people cope with the grief of losing a loved one. She often thought of Emily, and her heart still ached when she remembered the vibrant, funny, and kind girl she had once known. Sarah would visit the foundation that Grace and John had set up, offering her support and sharing stories of the time she had spent with Emily. She kept a picture of Emily in her office, a reminder of the friend she had lost but would never forget. Roswell too had changed. It wasn't the same town it had been before Emily's disappearance. The tragedy had left a permanent mark on its streets, but it had also brought the community closer together. People were more aware of the dangers that could be lurking in their midst, and they were more vigilant about looking out for one another. The town had learned the hard way that evil could exist in the most unexpected places. But they had also learned that, despite the darkness, there was always hope, that the pursuit of justice could bring light to even the most tragic of circumstances. And so, life in Roswell moved forward. People continued to live their lives, their memories of Emily lingering in the background. Her story was no longer one of an unsolved mystery, but of justice served. The case had been closed, the truth revealed, and the man who had taken Emily's life was behind bars. It was a bittersweet victory, but it was still a victory. The town could now breathe a little easier, knowing that someone had been held accountable for the pain caused by Emily's death. For Grace and John, there would never be a full sense of closure. They would never stop mourning their daughter. But they had found a way to live with the loss, to carry Emily's memory with them every day. They knew that no matter how much time passed, Emily would always be with them. In their hearts, in their actions, and in the lives they touched through the foundation they had created in her honor. Emily Carter had been stolen from them, but her spirit would live on, a reminder that justice could be found, even in the darkest of times.